Welcome to this episode of the Film Florida podcast. My name is John Lux. I'm the Executive Director of Film Florida, and I appreciate you downloading this episode of the podcast. Before I introduce our guests, if you haven't already done so, please be sure to subscribe, rate, and review the Film Florida podcast. The better our analytics are, the more likely others will be able to find us. Also, as a reminder, Film Florida has a merchandise page. Visit teespring.com/stores/filmflorida to purchase Film Florida t-shirts, sweatshirts, and coffee mugs. Our guests today are Florida filmmaking legends. Billy Corben and Alfred Spellman are award-winning film and television producers that co-founded Raconteur, a media studio in Miami. Their credits include Cocaine Cowboys and Screwball, as well as The U Part 2, and Broke for ESPN's 30 for 30 documentary series. As well known as Billy and Alfred are for their producing, they're even more well known for their storytelling skills. We talk about growing up in Florida and what drives them to find new stories to tell and new ways to tell those stories. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Billy Corben and Alfred Spellman. Billy and Alfred, thanks for joining us on the Film Florida podcast today.
Thanks for having us.
So let's start at the beginning. Billy, I believe you were born in Fort Myers, and Alfred, you were born in Miami Beach, but you met at a young age. How did your relationship start, and how did it grow into what it is today?
I'm a Florida native and a lifelong Miamian. When I was about 3 years old, my parents moved from Fort Myers down to the North Miami Beach area, a city famous for having beach in its name and no actual beach in the city. That's because everything in Florida is a real estate hustle, and most of the story of Florida is a story of lies that came true. So we lived in North Miami Beach, and I attended Highland Oaks Elementary School, followed by Highland Oaks Middle School, and it was there that I took a television production class with Sheila Spicer. She was already at that point a veteran Miami-Dade County Public School teacher, and in addition to teaching television production, produced a morning newscast that was broadcast through the closed circuit television station in the building of the school. She had identified Alfred and I taking a particular interest in producing the news and literally handed us the key to the studio and basically said, "You guys are in charge of this now," much to the chagrin of many of our classmates, I'm sure. And we just did it. We just produced the morning news every day. I anchored and did entertainment news. Alfred did sports news. He would actually come in early to school every day, as every normal middle school student does, come into school like considerably early, like half hour, 45 minutes, maybe an hour. I don't even remember because I wasn't there, for crying out loud, that early. And we were doing the news the day before. We would do it, and then it would broadcast. We'd air it the next day. So Alfred didn't want to air, stale sports highlights. So he would tape Sports Center on VHS, right at home the evening before, and then come in early to, we'd throw it to Alfred at the end of the now here's Sports with Alfred. And then Alfred would come in the morning, put together his highlight reel live, and then once we broadcast the, live on tape news and kicked it over to Alfred, Alfred would then switch over and broadcast his highlights, that he had just cut together that morning. Flash forward many years later, we are in Bristol, Connecticut at the headquarters of ESPN pitching our documentary, which at the time was called Hurricane Season, but later renamed The U. And we actually, in the interest of full disclosure, confessed the, hundreds of acts of copyright infringement that Alfred had committed by recording Sports Center and then repurposing it for our morning news at Highland Oaks Middle School.
That's great. Alfred, at that time, was filmmaking a career path, or was that just a fun hobby because you liked to do it at the time?
Well, at that point, it was during the era of the sports highlights. Billy was just talking about, this is the era of Dan Patrick and Keith Olbermann on Sports Center. So sportscasting seemed like a potential route as well. But similar to Billy, I grew up in Miami Beach. The year I was born in Miami Beach, I was like, Miami Beach was one of the only cities in the world that had more deaths than births. The most common responsibility for lifeguards on Miami Beach that year was to rescue heart attack victims on the sand. rather than to rescue drowning victims. And so I had gotten a camcorder at an early age and started out, my family's camcorder, started making home movies with some friends in the backyard. Little did I know Billy was doing the same thing up in North Miami Beach with his friends. And we ended up, as Billy said, in the same TV production class together. And I think we had a very kind of early division of responsibilities, not only between the sports coverage that I did and the entertainment coverage that Billy had done, but just in terms of producing and directing. And so it was really the next year after that when Billy went to New World School of the Arts in downtown Miami and I went to North Miami Beach Senior High that we said, well, let's go ahead and try to make an actual film, a short film. And so Billy had written a short screenplay entitled Waiting, about a teenage girl waiting for the results of her HIV blood test. We realized that not many people would give a couple of 14, 15-year-olds a bunch of money to go make films. So we said, well, maybe there's a way to do this through kind of the educational market. And we said, well, if it's teenagers educating teenagers, this is a great media hook. We could write some press releases, try to raise some money. And we raised about $15,000. We had all the local news outlets come to New World School of the Arts where we were holding auditions. And we had made a short film called Waiting, which premiered on World AIDS Day in 1994.
Wow! And
that was the first Spellman Corben production, as the name of our production company, or actually more like a law firm sounded at the time. But that was our very first production that we made with our third partner, David Sipkin, who Billy knew from how long have you known Dave, Bill? Since you were 3, 4 years old, right?
Oh yeah, preschool.
So that was our very first production.
So it's one thing to say, we're going to be filmmakers. A lot of people say that, and some are very successful, but it's a completely different thing to be the type of filmmakers that you guys are. Billy, how do you describe your style and your approach to filmmaking?
Well, we fell into documentary filmmaking. It was not something that we had studied. It was certainly a form that we were familiar with and fond of. We were fans of documentaries, but we hadn't studied it. None of us had, in fact. Even Dave, who went to film school at FSU, and I went, was in the film program at UM. We still didn't. I don't know that any of us took a course on nonfiction filmmaking, to tell you the truth. We just wanted to be filmmakers. My focus of study in the film department at UM was, in fact, screenwriting, which incidentally, the best course I ever took on directing or editing or cinematography or producing what was my screenwriting courses or were my screenwriting courses. That was the best education I could have got in filmmaking or any element or aspect of filmmaking. It teaches you about absolutely everything, the essentials of storytelling. But we found a story and decided to take a leave of absence from college and pursue it because we thought it was so compelling. And it became Raw Deal, A Question of Consent, which less than a year after we decided to take a leave of absence and hit the road to Gainesville to shoot it, less than a year later, it was premiering at the Sundance Film Festival, making us the youngest filmmakers in the history of that festival. And when we set out to make this story of an exotic dancer who had allegedly been sexually assaulted or had alleged she'd been sexually assaulted at a fraternity house at the University of Florida, the play I had done in my senior year at New World School of the Arts theater department was Rashomon, a play based on Akira Kurosawa's film, which was very reminiscent of a he said, she said, and then the truth kind of a structure in the story. And so that's how we really approached Raw Deal, was as if it were Akira Kurosawa's Rashomon. Similarly, when we did Cocaine Cowboys after that, we didn't approach it as a documentary, the same as Raw Deal. We said, let's do it like a gangster movie. So our approach, we later dubbed, or a friend had later dubbed, I should say, and we co-opted it. Our genre of nonfiction is pop docs, we call them, because aesthetically we kind of steer into a more pulpier pop culture curve rather than the traditional talking head documentary. I think that's reflected somewhat in the subject matter we choose, but also I think, or most significantly, in the style that we apply. And we just look at these documentaries as if they're movies, and we say, how would we make this if we were just making a scripted or narrative feature film? And I think it's important because still as a documentary filmmaker, you have an obligation to entertain and to keep the audience engaged in your story. The fact that it's a documentary doesn't mean that it has to be sort of treated with the production values or aesthetic of an educational a film. I always say that documentary itself is not a genre. It's a style of filmmaking, nonfiction film, and you can take any genre that you love in movies and make a documentary. In fact, I could probably point to a documentary that is a seminal film in any genre, or one of the greatest films in the genre. I mean, you name it: romance, action, sports, musical, science fiction, gangster. You name the genre of film that you enjoy, and I could point you towards documentaries that are some of the best films ever made in that genre.
If you look back at the summer of 1999, looking back now, that was really a transformational moment for us because two things happened. Number one is the Blair Witch Project had been released in theaters.
Right.
And it was the first time that a digital video production had been distributed to theaters around the world and had made $140 million some odd dollars. And, of course, it had premiered at Sundance but became this phenomenon in the summer of 1999. And that really opened our eyes to the potential of digital, that the world was changing and that digital production tools and technologies would only get better. And there were a series of narrative features after that. There was Chuck and Buck and Series 7 at Sundance. So there were kind of these indie films that were being shot on digital video. And it certainly seemed that the barriers to entry in terms of movie production, i.e. the cost of purchasing and shooting and then developing and exposing negative film, were going to plunge. So it was Blair Witch that kind of informed our thinking on the future of film production. And on the other side of it, the summer of 1999 was the time where we'd first gotten a DSL fast access internet line, and Napster became a phenomenon, which democratized distribution. And we looked at that and we said, well, if this is happening with music files, 3-4 megabyte files, individual songs, it's only a matter of time before penetration of broadband is going to increase and increase to the point where digital distribution will become possible. And so those two things happening right at the same time in the summer of 1999, now looking back on it 20 years later, our bet that would transform the business and the industry and the way that people would approach making movies certainly has proven correct. So those two things I think were definitely the most influential in terms of our career path now looking back on it.
Interesting. And Billy, you had mentioned Cocaine Cowboys in there. That film really put you guys on the map, I think. Talk about how that film came to be.
Well, when we were in Sundance, the documentary we had done, Raw Deal, A Question of Consent, was made quite a splash at the festival. The story of this dancer and what happened at this fraternity house was all captured on videotape, and we used that videotape footage and intercut it with the recounting of events by the dancer and some of the fraternity men, and it was completely uncensored, very disturbing, and it was the first movie that had sold out all of its tickets, we were told, when the advanced sales began, and it landed on the front page of the New York Post, and it was quite a stir, and we were all kind of caught up in this and the media coverage, and we did about something like 60 interviews in a matter of 5 or 6 days at the festival, and the last question of nearly every interview was exactly the same, and it was now that you've arrived, so to speak, are you going to move to New York or to LA? And just as obvious as it was to them that we would make that move, it was just as obvious to us that we wouldn't. And we had said, no, we're going back home to Miami because we want to tell Miami stories. And Florida in general seemed like such an untapped gold mine in the area of nonfiction filmmaking. It had been tapped certainly in journalism and certainly by nonfiction authors and fiction authors alike. We thought that there was an opportunity to mine the territory for some of the extraordinary characters and stories that we knew existed. And so that, along with the fact that we didn't want to be three more schmucks peddling our wares in New York or LA, which everybody seems to be.
Right.
we wanted our geography to be part of our brand. We wanted people, when you call somebody and you want to set up an interview or a meeting or whatever, or a pitch meeting, you want to be known as something. And so we wanted to be the Miami guys. I'm doing air quotes, which is not very helpful for podcasting, but I'm doing like the Miami guys. People would know those are the Miami guys. So that's what we wanted to do. It was a bit of a gamble at the time, I think. And also, to be perfectly candid, most people go to a festival like Sundance, they're already developing their next project. They have a development slate of things they want to do, or they've already begun, pre-pro on the next project. We weren't even finished editing the documentary that we were screening there yet. So we didn't even have an idea. We didn't know what the hell we wanted to do next. So, we needed to come back and finish the doc we were premiering and then figure out our next move. So we did. We came back and we had followed the case of Willie Falcone and Sal Magluta for some time, the drug trials and tribulations of these Cuban families, and had wanted to do something about them, but it seemed that the story hadn't ripened yet. It was the wounds were too fresh, and we wouldn't get the access that we wanted. But that was very much something in the world that we wanted to cover. And then, especially Alfred had a very close personal connection to the story through a friend's father who was an attorney on the case, literally growing up hearing about the case while he was talking on his cell phone in the car during carpool. Just as you do in Miami, hearing about major drug trafficking trials in carpool to elementary school and middle school and high school. And then I got a call from a cousin of mine who was at the pool in his condo in Aventura, Florida. And he calls me and says, I met this really interesting guy. Do you know who John Purnell Roberts is? And I said, let me ask Alfred. I said, Alfred, do you know who John Purnell Roberts is? And Alfred goes, oh, yeah, he was this cocaine wholesaler who worked with Max Mermelstein, who wrote a book called Man Who Made It Snow. And so I said, you want to go meet him at the pool at Cousin Dave's condo? Sure. And we go, we meet him. Really interesting guy. He puts us in touch with Mickey Monday, who is a smuggler that he worked with to some extent in the 1980s. And we decided that we were going to make a documentary called City Made of Snow about how Miami was built essentially on the narco dollars that trickled down into every aspect of life in South Florida in the 70s and 80s. And we called it City Made of Snow. We wanted it to be our Miami calling card documentary to establish us as the, quote, Miami guys. And that's how we got started on that.
And Alfred, at what point in the Cocaine Cowboys process did you realize that you guys had a game changer on your hands?
Well, we were working on Cocaine Cowboys for about a year and a half. And, it was at this point where we had tried to raise money for it initially from the industry. We had this big Sundance hit. We said, okay, we have this huge press kit. We'll go out, we'll try to raise money for this. And basically the response was very tepid. People had said, well, we just saw Blow had just come out, and there's Scarface and Miami Vice, and, is this story really interesting? And we kept thinking to ourselves, well, how many Italian gangster movies are there? Why is there only room in the market for this handful of stories about Miami in the 1980s, which other than, say, San Francisco during the gold rush or, the Netherlands in the Dutch tulip craze, produced such an economic boom and bust, and we thought this is just a fantastic story that has just been underexplored, and nobody really bought into it. And at the time, Grand Theft Auto Vice City was the biggest selling video game of all time. Michael Mann had announced that he was finally going to make his long-awaited Miami Vice feature. Anybody who watches an episode of MTV Cribs knows that Tony Montana had become this icon in youth urban culture. And we said, well, there's definitely a market for this, even if people aren't buying into it in the industry. So we just trucked ahead. We raised money, and we had this cut come around, I guess, maybe the fall of 2005. We started submitting it to festivals, and Tribeca accepted it. And we thought, okay, we'll have another raw deal on our hands in terms of press and popularity. And that didn't actually materialize.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I just want to interject for a moment that as young filmmakers, we thought everything we were doing was game changing. I mean, not just as far as headspace is concerned. We and it's not until you get older and you say, okay, not all of these are going to be like that. Some of these you just have to make. But it was a very ego-deflating experience where Alfred is going with this story.
Yeah, well, we knew we had, as Billy had said, we set out to make a gangster movie. Nobody had made documentaries about true crime, particularly drug documentaries, from the perspective of the smugglers and traffickers before. You watch an episode on Discovery Channel or Learning Channel at the time about drug trafficking. It was always told from the perspective of the DEA, the cops, the good guys chasing the bad guys. So we said, well, Marty Scorsese wouldn't make a drug movie that way. We're a gangster movie that way. We're going to make a gangster doc from this other perspective. And so when we got to Tribeca, I remember the very first review, Logan Hill's review in New York Magazine, was just a rave review. And the film premieres at the festival. We realized that very quickly that there was really only interest from two distributors at the time. One of them was Magnolia Pictures, which was and still is owned by Mark Cuban. And an executive there, Tom Quinn, took to it immediately. And we had a meeting, and after our Raw Deal experience, we knew that we had to take a little bit more control and have a little bit more of a game plan going in. As Billy said, when we were making Raw Deal and it premiered at Sundance, we were still editing the movie. So in this case, we went to Tom and we said, look, if this is merchandised, if this is sold as kind of a traditional documentary that's merchandised at Best Buy, say in the special interest section next to the Pilates videos, DVDs and so forth, we're not going to really move units. But if you can merchandise this and market this as a gangster movie, we think that we can do some serious business with this. And Tom, to his credit, totally saw the vision, bought in immediately. And what was really attractive about Magnolia to us was that they owned their own DVD distribution arm. Most of the smaller indies at that time, unless they were studio-affiliated indies, subcontracted DVD distribution out, which of course means another layer of profit being scraped off the top. So we thought, here's a distributor who gets it, who has their own DVD distribution arm. Of course, this is in the middle of the DVD boom of the mid-zeros, and so we said, okay, this is the way to go. And we did a deal with Magnolia, and the film Cocaine Cowboys opened in October of 2006.
So, guys, I was an athlete growing up, and I've always been into sports, and college football is still my number one. Growing up in the Chicago area like I did, it's basically a Notre Dame city. And my best friend growing up was a huge Miami Hurricanes fan. And if you were anti-Notre Dame like I was, the perfect fit was to be a Canes fan like my friend was. So watching the U brought back some great childhood memories. And Billy, you had mentioned your trip to Bristol. How did the U come to be? Did you pitch it to them? Did they come to you? Talk about how that process came to be.
It was on our list. We had a list of Miami stories that we wanted to tell. Organically, they say you write what you know. And so organically, our list of Miami stories at first was all born out of our childhoods in Miami. So Alfred, for example, when we started work on Cocaine Cowboys, or what was at first called City Made of Snow, he brought in a Polaroid of his first drug bust. As you do as a kid growing up in South Florida. He had been driving along with his mom one day and passed a Marine Patrol. Basically had seized this boat filled with what appeared to be bales of marijuana, and Alfred ran home and got his Polaroid camera and snapped a picture of it. What's particularly funny about that is in our research for the documentary, we later discovered actual news images of the same bus from the opposite angle that Alfred had shot it from I think the Miami News Archives or somewhere at History Miami downtown. So, and I had very distinct memories of my grandfather and my father taking us to the Orange Bowl, where they were Miami Dolphins and then Miami Hurricanes season ticket holders. It was very clear that something, very special beyond football was happening there. There's something about the venue itself and the location of the venue that's very much, the city was the campus because there was no on-campus stadium. So the city, Little Havana in particular, was the campus on which the Orange Bowl was located and where these games took place. And of course, with the alumni base being much smaller than a state school, the fan base is predominantly people who are not alumni of the university. So there was a real sense of community and camaraderie and something very unique around this college football program. It was also a small private school in Coral Gables, which is not known for its diversity of demographics or population. And suddenly you had these young men coming from some of the tougher neighborhoods, not Coral Gables, but some of the tougher neighborhoods in Miami, the West Grove and Liberty City and Overtown and Carroll City and Allapattah, coming into Coral Gables and playing a kind of football that I think and a style of football that was not expected. And so this was on our list as a special story that we wanted to tell. And in fact, when we were aware that ESPN Films at the time, which was a very small division, remains a very small division of the mothership of ESPN, and they had done some documentaries, they'd done some scripted stuff, but there wasn't anything really organized, at ESPN Films under any other banner ESPN Films. And so we called them to pitch what we were calling hurricane season at the time, later the U, and got an executive on the phone who was a young guy who was a big Cocaine Cowboys fan, and just by happenstance. And we said we want to basically do the Cocaine Cowboys of college football, is essentially how we were pitching it, since he knew what that meant, just aesthetically,
right.
Stylistically. And that's how that started. And when they picked it up, it was just a one-off feature, 2-hour documentary for ESPN Films. And it wasn't until about a year into the process that they called us and said, we're about to start the 30th anniversary of the network. And Bill Simmons and some of us came up with an idea to celebrate it with 30 documentaries by 30 different filmmakers, calling it 30 for 30. And we want to put the U under that umbrella, which made perfect sense because our story really begins in earnest in 1979, which is exactly when ESPN began. So it made sense to do that, and that's how it just accidentally became part of 30 for 30.
And to this day is maybe one of the most well-known of the series, which has gone well beyond 30 films.
Oh, yeah, it's been like 1,000 films. I remember Connor, who was the executive we originally got on the phone, who is now the big boss. I remember a quote from him in his article saying, the reason why the U is so great is because it's not 2 hours of content. It's tens of thousands of hours of content, because they replay it endlessly across all of their networks and platforms, and people watch it over and over and over again. So I think it's helpful, certainly, that they premiered it after the Heisman Trophy ceremony, which was a live, one of the only live slots that after which they, or live lead-ins, I should say, that they premiere 30 for 30s after. And then they've just been pretty committed to what we always try to do with not every doc, but most of our docs, is try to create something that's rewatchable.
Sure.
I just talked to someone who said, I love your new movie Screwball. I've watched it 10 times on Netflix. And so we try to create content that lends itself to that, and ESPN identified that in the U and has been playing it on a loop, it seems, ever since.
Well, and I've seen it at least 10 times, so I can attest that it works. You had mentioned Screwball, so let's talk about that for a little bit. That came out in 2018 and is about Major League Baseball's performance-enhancing drug era, and specifically Alex Rodriguez. But you don't just tell the story. You tell the story using kids as actors, which is fascinating. Where did that creative come from, and what made you tell the story that way?
I'm really curious to hear how Alfred tells this story, because I say that because, it was my ridiculous idea, and I came to Alfred and Dave with it, and then the next thing I knew, it was just like understood that this was happening. This is how we were going to handle it. We just had a challenge with the story because it's not a sports documentary. You mentioned it's about the performance-enhancing drug scandal and Alex Rodriguez, but there's no baseball really in the movie. It's not a sports movie or a movie about baseball. So we didn't have a lot of sports footage or game footage that we could integrate into this edit. We had these, I think, really strong, really fun interviews that we had done, and we had this great radio edit strung together of just great talking heads interviews, but no B-roll, very little archive that we could put on top of it, because all of these sketchy goings-on occurred in a locker room, in a hotel room, in a bar, in a nightclub, in a shady fake doctor's clinic, in a strip mall in Miami. So there was no footage of that existed. So we knew we needed to shoot something. So it was most likely we're going to have to do reenactments, which I don't like for several reasons, not the least of which is they're very hard to do well.
Right.
And so you have
and very expensive.
It's very expensive to absolutely to execute on and to do well. And not to mention that as documentary filmmakers, we love research. We love getting, discovering assets, visual and otherwise, that have not been seen before, and that are the real evidence that support the stories you're hearing. So people know that there is credibility, in the journalism that we've done. And so when you're doing a recreation or reenactment, you're inventing something from scratch. Everybody knows it. And so as documentary filmmakers, we sometimes fancy ourselves journalists, and we like to make our case or at least provide support for our interview subjects. So I know this is absurd what they're saying, but it's all true. It's totally, we researched it. It's verifiable. Here is the evidence, the documents, the footage that backs this up. So to do something, we're always trying to keep it real as documentarians, and recreations are fake. So it just ideologically, we have a kind of we find it distasteful sometimes. But here we didn't have a choice. So that's really, and I always say limitations breed creativity. So we didn't have a choice. We had to do it. We had to do something, I should say. And the movie was always called Screwball. So just like going into Cocaine Cowboys or Raw Deal or Square Grouper or The U or Limelight, we had an aesthetic, a style book kind of in mind of how we wanted to present the story and the tone, most importantly, that we wanted. We knew it was a comedy. Like I said, we called it Screwball. The way we approached the interviews themselves were with lightness and humor, and I think we got that out of our interview subjects. And so we wanted to kind of continue in that farcical vein. And so through a series of inspiration, starting with Spike Jonze' 1997 posthumous Biggie music video, Sky's the Limit, all the way through a very merry, unauthorized children's Scientology pageant, which is a Florida documentary we never got to make. I thought of this idea, particularly after listening to the interviews we had gotten from Tony Bosch, who was the fake doctor, unlicensed physician, and Porter Fisher, the whistleblower in the case. They're very vivid storytellers, and they speak in dialogue. Both of them have the same style of storytelling. They say, I walked into his office and I said, I want my money. He said, I don't have your money. And I said, you better get my money. And he said, what are you going to do about it? And I said, I'm going to wring your neck. And they both talked like that. And so I realized that we could drunk history it, meaning we could have the actors lip sync the actual dialogue right from our interview subjects in the reenactments. And the only difference here is that all of our actors would be 8 years old because I thought it was tonally appropriate. I thought all the adults in this story acted like children. Ultimately, the real victims in this story were not the baseball players, professional baseball players, Major League Baseball players, but in fact the high school kids that Tony Bosch had treated and rightfully went to federal prison for doing so. And not to mention the kids who were told that these men are heroes and they should look up to them and worship them, and they're just, like any of us, just flawed human beings that are perhaps not worthy of that adulation. So it just all seemed it checked all the boxes for me, and I called up Alfred. I don't even remember. What did I say? I think I was drunk anyway when I came up with it. So
I'm trying to remember the exact moment where that happened. It just seems so natural, and it seems so appropriate, such an appropriate treatment for this story. And to follow up what Billy said, we spent the better part of 15 years building a a style, building a brand for Raconteur, telling stories with, as Bill said, pop doc stories with a lot of archive footage layered in. And that was always a thrill for us to go and find, as Billy said, to go and find just the appropriate piece of archive footage. And in considering stories, that was always something that we had to take into account. Can you tell this story? How would you tell the story? You can't just do it as an interview. You need to see something, which is one of the reasons why we're exploring now podcast storytelling, because it allows us to tell stories that we don't necessarily have visual accompaniment for.
Right. There's
kind of two rules in-house when we consider a story. One is, why is this not better as a 60 minutes or a Dateline piece, a 17, 18-minute piece? What is the mandate here for a feature doc or some sort of long-form treatment of the story? And then the second is, well, what actually are you going to see? So we knew immediately that this was a problem with this story, and it was something that we kind of just put off, and we were cutting the story together, and it wasn't anything that we actually had a solution for. So when Billy came up with it, it's like, yeah, okay, great, let's do that.
And the interesting thing is, you had mentioned the expense of it, and just sort of, an inside baseball anecdote, no pun intended. In our sports documentaries, the ones that we, that are sports themed, we have a line item for league footage, which can be very expensive when you license it. Well, there was no league footage, so we did have a little bit of money in the budget, a little kind of fat built in for something, in the event that we needed it. We just budgeted it the same as we did every other sports-themed doc. As Alfred says, budgeting a documentary is more art than science, but we had the sort of money built in where we had a bit of a buffer where we said, well, there's no league footage. There's literally like no baseball footage in this hour and 40-minute movie. So we said, like, okay, well, as long as we can do the reenactments for no more than that amount of money, then we might be able to pull it off. So we started to storyboard in the script based on really like that feeling. So there were scenes we cut out, a car chase, for example, that really happened, that we cut out just because we couldn't afford it based on the budget. We just thought that this story was like freebasing Florida fuckery. We just thought it was the sort of the culmination of thus far of our career in nonfiction filmmaking as far as telling Florida-centric, stories or Miami-centric stories or Floridiana. And we just wanted to nail it. We wanted to do it really well. We worked really hard to do it.
And Alfred, at this point in your careers, do you guys look for projects, or do projects come to you? How do things come about for you guys?
We always joke at Raconteur that when you get out of prison, the first call is to your mother and the second call is to us to tell your story. And, these days it's still a mix of both. But I have to say that other than, maybe one or two, maybe three projects that we've done, almost everything has been generated. The idea itself has been generated in-house. And luckily for us, as Floridians, we never run out of batshit crazy Florida stories to tell. So it's kind of become a brand for us. And, in the same way that Edna Buchanan or Carl Hyacin or Dave Barry or John D. McDonald, kind of the great Florida storytellers in literature, we've kind of carved this niche for ourselves in nonfiction storytelling. So it's really just a matter of, and Billy and I are voracious consumers of news, and you can probably tell that by our Twitter feeds, but that's kind of where a lot of the germs for these ideas come together. And at the end of the day, if you look at kind of what unites our storytelling, there's a couple things about the stories that we pick, and one of the themes that is prevalent throughout our work is kind of this pursuit of the American dream by any means necessary, and that certainly unites Cooking Cowboys, Dogfight, our backyard MMA fight movie. And, we're always looking for stories that just kind of are emblematic of the state. And so, there's kind of a whole list of things that we've developed that we wish we can do, that we still hope to do. There's things that we've abandoned, and one day we'll kind of clean out the archive and maybe talk about a bunch of those. But we get calls from people all the time, but at the end of the day, a lot of our stuff is just generated from things that Billy and I kind of come across in the news.
And Billy, how do you prioritize some of those ideas? I mean, how do you guys decide this is one that we're going to take on and this is one that's going to maybe go on the shelf for a little while?
Alphabetical order of the felony. No, I'm just kidding. It's a really good question. Often it's not up to us because, we don't always have what we need to tell the story. The Falcone Magluta, anecdote I told earlier, very much to that point that, we wanted to tell that story, but we just didn't have access to the people that we needed to at that time. The story hadn't ripened yet. People weren't ready to go on camera and tell that story in the first person, which I think is also pretty key to what we do, is the first person productions, the I and we, not they and he, which I think the audience obviously has a much greater connection to for all kinds of reasons. You're hearing first person storytelling right from the horse's mouth, rather than second and third party accounts. So you don't have the assets you need to tell the story. You're going to have to back burner it or deprioritize it. And so, I apply a rule of thumb that is not foolproof, but it's idiot-proof, that I call RAS. And it's just a three-pronged test, because we get ideas all the time. Some of them are better than others, obviously. People tell us ideas all the time that they think are the greatest ideas ever, and some of them may be, but how do you know? And so I apply this RAS test, and R stands for relevance. We look at the story and we say, if we're going to spend a year plus of our lives devoted to telling this story, is there going to be an audience for it? Is anybody going to care on the back end of this? Is it relevant? And topical is different from relevance. So something might be in the news, it might be topical, it might be things that people are talking about, but is anyone going to devote the time or possibly the money or the energy to seek this out, to watch it, to pay for it potentially? They might not if it's topical, because they might just be exhausted of the topic. So relevance is different. Relevance is, will somebody care? Is there an audience for this content? And it doesn't have to be a huge audience, just an audience, period. Will it be worth our while? So we're not just indie filmmakers producing the proverbial tree falling in the forest with no one around to see it or hear it. A lot of these movies don't make a sound, and so
Right.
We'd like people to see our stuff and like it to be relevant and part of the conversation. A in the RAS test is access, what I was talking about before. It's not what you know, it's who you know. And in filmmaking, access is key to nearly everything. I mean, you name it, access to interview subjects or actors or sets or equipment or, knowledgeable crew, locations, costume. I mean, you name it, access to whatever it is you need to tell your story. Do you have that access? And if you don't, I think the whole thing's going to fall apart. And the last thing is in RAS is style, which is, it's not what you say, it's how you say it. And what are you bringing to the table as a storyteller, as a filmmaker, that makes you the only people, or uniquely situated at least, to tell this story in a way that's going to be compelling to an audience? So what is your aesthetic, or how are you going to tell this story that's going to make it exciting and worthwhile?
Billy mentioned earlier, alluded to a comment I often make, that budgeting docs are more art than science, and that's typically because, unlike, say, a narrative feature film where you have your script and you have your cast and you have your sets and you have your art director and your kind of all the constituent pieces in place before the first day of production, on a doc, often the opposite is true. We'll occasionally shoot interviews on spec for a project because we just happen to get access to them. Or we shoot enough to cut a reel so that we could go raise money for a project. So oftentimes when we start, we don't know exactly how it's going to end. So that's the big difference. Documentary filmmaking is very much a leap of faith in that respect, unless you're telling kind of a closed-end historical story that is almost scripted. Oftentimes with our projects, it's dependent, as Billy said, on who you have access to and what they actually tell you when the cameras start to roll.
Well, given all of that, the challenges that everybody knows about filmmaking, what advice do you give people when they come up to you and say, I want to get in the industry, I want to be like you guys? What do you tell them?
Go to medical school?
We were just talking about this the other day, actually. It's so much more. We got very, very lucky in that we caught the last wave of limited content. And when I say limited content, even in the early to mid zeros, we all had, 80, 90, 100 cable channels and certainly access to the web. But there was a way to cut through the noise. while it's definitely more difficult to break through in terms of signal-to-noise ratio, the good news is for people that there are more outlets than ever to exhibit your work and who are commissioning your work. When Billy and I started out making docs, there were no, other than HBO and the Showtime, to some extent, Discovery Channel, there were not a lot of homes for feature documentaries. And of course, now it's the golden age of documentaries between all the streaming services, Netflix and Hulu and Amazon, as well as the traditional theatrical distributors, as well as the proliferation of cable channels. So to the extent that there are more opportunities to work, it's a golden age of documentary filmmaking. Your question was about kind of cutting through and breaking through, and I think that is more difficult than ever before. But the good news certainly is that there's a lot more places that are paying lots of good money to make docs these days.
Our gamble of becoming the Miami guys and getting a reputation and building a brand as the Miami guys paid off, but I think we may have done it at the last possible window of opportunity before it became far more difficult to break through. So now people do know, and people who grew up watching the U and Cocaine Cowboys are now decision makers. You know, our executives who are in a position to say, oh, I want to work with those guys who I remember watching Cocaine Cowboys on bootleg in my dorm room. And part of the Cocaine Cowboys phenomenon was on the bootleg DVD market in the summer of 2006, months before the movie was ever properly, legally, commercially released. And that wouldn't necessarily break through as much now. There isn't a bootleg DVD market. Certainly people could stream it and share it that way. But I just don't think, you know, even if we're making Cocaine Cowboys today, you know, we wouldn't really have an opportunity to break through even in that underground market the way that it did just over a decade ago. So I think that timing is everything, of course, but a lot of timing is luck, and I think that we really lucked out.
Right, and the definition of success today is much different than it was, you know, even 5 years ago, let alone 10 and 15, 20 years ago.
I think that that's probably true, but also I think it's the same in that, you know, I say a successful filmmaker is a filmmaker that gets to work again. You know, it's not box office or critical acclaim or award. It's, do you get a chance to make another movie or make another documentary? And if you're really successful, you can make a living doing it. And I think that that's the major difference now, is that there's sort of this, you know, working class or middle class of filmmakers that is not as prominent, but I think is probably larger than it was years ago, when it was just sort of, you know, the big names that were able to have the clout and the opportunity to work. We can make a living being documentary filmmakers now.
You mentioned, you know, success being, can you work again? So what is next for you guys?
We have a feature documentary that we're working on right now about Florida man, Macho Man Randy Savage, the professional wrestler. We're doing that for A&E. A&E has rebooted their biography strand, their 1 hour kind of formatted series, into a 30 for 30 type series where they're commissioning individual directors to tell feature-length stories. And so they approached us. And so we are doing one on Macho Man Randy Savage that will premiere in the first quarter of 2020. We have a couple other things that are cooking right now, but none that we can talk about just yet.
Excellent. So this was great, guys. Thanks for taking the time to talk with us today and sharing your stories and the stories behind the stories. There's no doubt when people think of storytelling here in Florida, you guys are at the top of the list. So it's been great to connect you with our audience.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Film Florida podcast. To learn more about Billy and Alfred, visit raconteur.com. For more information about Film Florida, go to filmflorida.org or visit our social media pages on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Check out the Film Florida merchandise at teespring.com/stores/Film Florida. And please remember to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast.